we switch gears from Mark's gospel to John's gospel now. We begin with chapter 6 with the only miracle that appears in all four gospels, and then another miraculous story related to others at the sea. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where do we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test Philip, for Jesus himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 6 months' wages would not be enough bread for each of them to get just a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here. He has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was a great deal of grass in the place where they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Jesus took the loaves. When he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." They gathered them up, and from the fragments of 5 barley loaves left by those that had eaten, they filled up 12 baskets. And the people saw the sign Jesus had done, and they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark. Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough. A strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat. They were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat. And immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Reading ends here. This is an incredible abundance of scriptural passages, insights, riches. This morning, I'm going to try to touch at least some of them this morning. The David story we read is one that lives out Psalm 14. How do we live as if there is no God? And the answer is unimaginably. David, the great priest who leads the ark into Jerusalem. David, the great writer of Psalms. David, the one who's beloved, his name's meaning. The one after God's own heart, the anointed one of Israel, God's favorite, acts like this, where it's almost as he's doing a checklist. How many of the second tablet of the commandments can I destroy in just a matter of moments? Success and power, we're told, allow us to drift away from God, even when we're David. Religion seems to fare better in the rigors of Sparta, in the face of troubles, more than in the comforts of the palace. Notice that David's sins are in an interconnected flow, but one wrong follows another, all in his desperate attempt to cover up his rape of Bathsheba. Here we get a banquet of sin: adultery, murder, coveting, false witness, secrets, power, abuse of power, all there together. One course of sin leads directly to another until he is pretty much run out of room, or at least run through the life of Uriah. Let's be real clear here. David already has 6 wives, but his roving eye catches Bathsheba bathing. And look at then the words that all go here. It keeps saying, send, take, send, take. Just like Samuel had predicted that kings would do, David does. Send, send, send. Like he's dealing with an object, like he's pressing the send button on email. Not dealing with human beings, but things, the objects. At best, he's captivated by Bathsheba's beauty, and desire and lust have taken over him. Or maybe it's just he sees something he likes and he decides to add it to his grasp. If the world's my oyster, why not yet another thing? I find it impossible to detect any romance here. She's being treated like any other object for the palace to be decorated. Any issue of relationship, especially hers with Uriah, not even imagined, it seems. Every one of these sins are connected with an abuse of power. If sin is acting in the absence of God, forgetting about God, denying a God, we witness its full extent in this brilliant catalog of wrong, all acted on by God's own favorite. We get a decisively different view of the world when we act with full knowledge of the reality and power of God. Kingdom lessons here at the hand of Jesus. Now, instead of power being abused, it's created to share abundance, to share what people need to survive, to live, indeed to flourish there on the mountain. There's spiritual hints all through this passage. Maybe the critical one is that sometimes just a little bit is plenty. That we live in a world of abundance. Physical, material, social, spiritual. But we don't act like it. Imprisoned by an image of scarcity, of not having enough, of the dread fear that there's never going to be enough. Maybe the more dread fear, somebody else is going to get my share. We live half-lived lives. But Jesus presents in God's way access to abundance. 5 barley loaves, 2 fish, feed 5,000. And that's no accident that it's 5,000 here, the size of a Roman legion, because at the end, they want to become a legion of their own, make Jesus king, fight Rome, legion to legion, use the power of Jesus to offer abundance, to feed a multitude, to strike down the soldiers of Rome. It's Passover time. That cannot be an accident that John puts that there or emphasizes it. Passover moves from death to life, from slavery to freedom. Passover will continue, if you will, as the sea is parted and all Israel walks through it. Then what happens? They're out there in the desert and they don't have enough to eat. Manna and quail rain down from the sky. But remember, there was only enough for every person to be satisfied, to eat their fill. If you tried to save any, other than the Sabbath preparation, it rotted before your very eyes. Here, the people eat until they're satisfied, but there's leftovers. 12, maybe for the 12 tribes of Israel, a whole people, there's enough leftovers to fill 12 baskets. Out of 2 fish, 5 barley loaves, more than enough for everyone to live, to grow, to flourish. More than enough to eat, plenty for leftovers. Unlike David, Jesus is showing no signs or designs of wanting a kingship, of wanting power over other people. Unlike David, squirreled away in the palace, Jesus hides, but only to appear before his small band in a most unlikely place, striding on the sea at night. Again, John links these passages. Jesus can give abundance from little. Now he walks on the great symbol of death and uncertainty, the sea at night, and strides over it like the ancient gods of old. Jesus, John's reminding us, is utterly of the Creator God. God's own power, God's own presence here before us. And what does he say? Don't be afraid. Maybe that's the core of human sin often. Fear of others, of not being enough, maybe even fear of God. And when we act out of fear, we often make mistakes. But there they are, in that symbol of the early church, the boat. I remind you that we have the Scottish wooden ceiling in this church to give us the feel in part that we're in the hold of a ship, that we're promised safety, stability, security in the midst of the storm. And Jesus doesn't even ride the waves any longer. The second he gets into the boat, it appears, they're ashore. They've been straining at the oars 3 or 4 miles, it says. Jesus is with them. They're back on dry land. I don't get in these stories the testing of Philip. Why Philip? Why the test? Was he expected to know that the feeding of the 5,000 would occur? Has anxiety about what are we going to do with all these people distorted his vision? Philip emerges from a scarcity consciousness. We don't have enough. How are we going to feed all these people? Jesus responds. Philip says, but we don't have that kind of money. It's 6 months' wages. What are we going to do? We bring those sorts of questions to the table all the time. We emphasize the problem, and the lack and incapacity and obstacles. And we lack the abundant, fertile imagination to see another way around or through the issue. Fear, anxiety inhibits a broader imagination. It inhibits our hope for a new and different future. Jesus shows them abundance, like the abundance of a communion table. But I bet I know what happened that's not in the story here. I bet as soon as the people got their bread and fish, they started complaining almost immediately. Is this bread gluten-free? I don't like this kind of fish. If only it were smoked and not fresh. This fish is too salty. I don't even like fish. I want beef. Hey, Apostle, are your hands clean? Have you properly sanitized before you hand me this bread and fish? Andrew caught a glimpse of a little when he noticed the boy with the bread. But he doesn't see it as an asset, but yet as another problem. He sees that resources succumb to negative reality, what we don't have enough of, what's so little among so many. But for Jesus, that's all he needed, to feed a multitude and to have baskets of leftovers. At the sea at night, we see an abundance of fear. And I understand that. Is Jesus an apparition? Is it really Jesus standing on the sea? Am I really seeing God incarnate walking toward me? And they make it to the shore immediately. If you've ever been on a plane when you've had a rough descent and you land, there's this feeling of relief and almost exaltation that you made it. They realize maybe for the first time that the God of nature is the God of abundance, but also the God of stillness in the midst of the storm. All the storms we face in life, within and without. Jesus is the God who can quell the storm within us. Jesus is the God that can keep us safe, even in the little boat, tossed by the waves, especially if that little boat is the church. This is the God of the abundance of nature, who can face down the danger of scarcity and storm, day and night. This is the God of rest and work. This God who calms the storm. This God that calms the rage of being angry that we don't have enough or that somebody else is getting more than their share. This is a God of God-breathed imagination. The beautiful prayer in Ephesians is a wonderful prayer to read in worship anytime, but this day as well. It talks about the length and breadth and height and depth. Every time we come into church, we're getting the length of history. We're getting a broad view of God's dealing with the world and human nature. Every time we walk into church, we're being invited into the depth of God's love for human beings. Every time we walk into this church for worship, we are invited to reach the very heavenly heights. Promised, as the prayer says, that God's fullness can fill up the empty places of life. That God's love is greater than we can even imagine or certainly know. We just had a wedding shower here, and some of the folks are going to be part of the wedding, and so they wanted to come up afterward and look around at the church. It's so often when people do that, they look around, they go, oh, this is so pretty. No argument. But I think what they're struggling for is something different. This is awe-inspiring. I am in a very special, sacred place here. When we walk in here in this small ship of the Spirit, we embody the prayer of Ephesians. In all our depths, whether it's gain of insight, gain of a sense of self, gain in a view of God, or facing the terrible depths of storms that afflict us all, we come right here, face to face with the God of nature, the God of abundance, the God of an abundant love and trust, where our cups always runneth over.